I think Bitcoin is often the same thing. You quite rightly point out people's perception of it, public perception of it, might not meet the actual reality of what the actual technology is capable of doing and achieving. So there's that public perception piece that would need to be addressed. Like what would it look like if a major entity, publicly listed entity in New Zealand, sort of announced that it's getting into Bitcoin mining?
Hello, I am Cody Allingham, and this is the Transformation of Value, a place for thinkers and builders, where together we ask questions about freedom, energy, and creativity through the lens of Bitcoin. Today I'm joined by Nick Wilson, who has spent over 2 decades working in energy and sustainability policy internationally, most recently at Mercury in New Zealand, helping lead the company's energy transition strategy. We ask, how does the energy market work, and what are the political and market forces at play? Who is deciding what the sustainability goals are, and what are the real-world challenges? What is the connection between renewable energy and the need for flexible demand? And how can Bitcoin mining fit into all of this? I would like to know what you think. Send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com and I will get back to you. Now, if you enjoyed this episode and the work I'm doing, please consider a value for value donation through my website or directly to the show's Bitcoin wallet. Otherwise, on to the show. Started working on this concept of the transformation of value about 2 years ago, which is kind of like, it's quite an encompassing thing around energy, freedom, money as well. Really interested in Bitcoin and how it kind of changes the game when it comes to the way economies work. And it sort of feeds, and from my perspective, I can see it feeding down into a lot of these other things. And so I think when you take it through the Bitcoin lens, it's like this actually does impact grids. And I'm sure we'll get into this, but you'd be familiar with mining and that sort of thing. And
Yeah. I'm really interested. I mean, I'm equally as interested to learn from you about these sorts of technologies. And, I know very little about it really in terms of its capabilities, but it seems to me that having flexibility of your loads is a really big opportunity in the grids. And particularly in New Zealand as well. And I don't know to what extent these models are being rolled out and overseas. And so I'd be really keen to learn from you as well a little bit about kind of what that landscape looks like.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that. And I mean, something you've said actually is flexibility is key in the transition of NZ's energy sector, especially with our limited hydro and with gas challenges. And I guess, I mean, before we dive into that though, maybe we could talk a little bit about your background, Nick, because I know you've worked overseas, you've done a lot of different things. So maybe you could just give us sort of a high level on your formal background in regards to energy and sustainability, please.
Yeah, no, happy to. So I guess the broad brush on that is I roughly sort of had about 25 years plus at the moment career working in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. So the split there roughly is probably about half that time I've been in New Zealand, and half that time's been overseas. And really, my roles have always been in the sustainability policy sort of space. So I identified sort of very early on in my career that I found sustainability to be a really interesting, fascinating space, and it was. At that stage, it was very nascent, so I didn't really quite know how to get into it. So I did my first degree overseas, my postgraduate degree at London School of Economics. At that time, was in sustainability and kind of like environmental assessment and policy, and that really triggered for me a real interest in what does this actually mean? So what am I going to focus on? And the general split was for that first part of my career was working mostly in the NGO space and for associations. So I first started off with a company called Forum for the Future that had this novel idea that businesses were probably part of the solution for sustainability, not the problem necessarily, or at least not all of the problem. And that with the right settings and the right incentives could actually do some good. And that was a really fascinating time for me. And I first got involved in energy when I worked for the Royal Academy of Engineering in their policy space. And we did the first sort of seminars on what does wind look like for the UK, like how are we going to build more wind farms? And that really got me intrigued. And energy is a really tangible transition for sustainability. That was a really tangible element of what a sustainable future look like because we need to decarbonize our energy systems. And so I felt that was really where I wanted to spend my career. And it wasn't until I moved to Australia and started working for the Energy Supply Association of Australia there in a policy role, managing that policy team, that we really got into the nuts and bolts of how energy markets work, what the challenges were. Australia at that time was mostly 90% coal. And someone like me, just to see how that's transitioned even over the period since the last 13 or 14 years since I've been back in New Zealand, it's actually staggering to see how quickly they've managed to get to much higher penetrations of renewables. And by the time I left Australia, I was coming to New Zealand, which is a completely different environment where we already had world-leading levels of renewables. It was almost the complete opposite to Australia, but yet we still faced some very similar challenges in terms of how we're going to, build enough renewables to meet the very obvious demands that we were going to be having from other sectors. And so I've always been involved. I guess my background's always been in the policy engagement space. For Mercury, which is the company I most recently worked for, and started off with Mighty River Power, moved towards became Mercury later on, one of New Zealand's largest electricity generator retailers, largest wind farm portfolio, now the largest retailer. So it was a really exciting journey to go through with them to set up the first government affairs and sustainability functions, which is my role there, and really help them to think about what does a sustainable transition mean, listening to our stakeholders, trying to understand the challenges that New Zealand faced and then what role that company was going to play. And then I guess from this year, I've completely shifted again. I've moved out of the corporate environment and into pursuing my passion. I decided to take some time out to pursue my passion about helping early stage companies in the innovation space that are looking to make transformative change into some of the new sustainable technologies. And I think it's really exciting. I mean, this is something that I find really exciting about having a career in the energy space and sustainable transition space, has been just incredible innovation that's coming out now. And not just within energy. You mentioned your background in agriculture. Biotech in New Zealand is a really exciting space as well. Aerospace, there's a lot of innovation that's occurring across a range of different parts of the economy. And energy is a real critical one, of course, because of the fact that energy is getting into electricity, renewable electricity is getting into other parts of the economy, like transport and process heat. And increasingly AI as well, with the energy demands there as a real driving force. So I've been quite focused on trying to understand the landscape in New Zealand, and I've been very privileged and lucky to have come across the guys at Outset Ventures, who in the VC world, who have been doing some really exciting work. They've got an amazing facility up here in Auckland at Future House, where you've got a lot of people doing deep tech startups, doing some amazing technology, and it's really opened my eyes, I think, to just how many clever people that we've got in this country doing some amazing experiments and trying to get these technologies scaled up. And I'm really excited to, as this part of my journey, to focus on how I support those companies in their journey. So,
yeah. Thank you. That's very comprehensive. And I certainly agree with the sentiment that there's a lot of innovation coming out of New Zealand. I mean, we've kind of had to make it work with these southern islands that are at the bottom of the world. We have to be smart about things. And I think I'm really interested to come back to your time at Mercury Energy, which I know generates a lot of its electricity from hydro stations on the Waikato River, and there's also a lot of geothermal. I believe there might have even just been a new geothermal that opened up recently. I saw something on the news. Was it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's it by Contact Energy. Yeah.
Oh, is that Contact? Okay. So I mean, clearly though, there is this bigger opportunity with geothermal, and I know you spent quite a bit of time at Mercury in that role, and I think it's interesting to explore what this means, because New Zealand, also by virtue of being isolated and not being connected to any other countries, has this real big question of energy sovereignty. And when we look at it, I guess holistically, energy underpins everything. Without power, without energy, you really can't do anything, and everything comes to a stop. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that, because it's quite a unique situation for us to be so far away. Most countries are connected to someone else, and they can get get electricity in, but we have to do it all ourselves. I mean, how does that figure into, I guess, when you were looking at policy and that sort of thing? How do you sort of see all that connecting?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's actually it's a really great insight, and it is a challenge, right? It's our geographical isolation is a significant challenge to us. We can't rely on massive grids that span across continents. So that how that plays out for us, particularly in New Zealand, is the level of our hydro storage, for example. Overseas, you see in other countries that are blessed with hydro resources, I'm thinking like the Norways and Scandinavian countries, they have very deep hydro storage that can go for years, and they're providing electricity, so much so that they actually build interconnections to other parts of Europe to be able to share that energy. We don't have that luxury here, and we actually have very, very shallow storage in New Zealand comparatively. Roughly speaking, you have about 6 weeks worth of storage. So if you go into a dry sequence, you can find yourself caught short in terms of the fuel supply that's actually within that system. And we've seen that play out earlier this year as well, where we went through a particularly dry sequence. And you can have some very deep dry years that can become quite problematic. So this whole concept of dry year risk, that we're not connected to other energy systems, so we can't just import. We have to think about solutions domestically is actually one of the challenges, or probably one of the most significant challenges we face, particularly when predominantly we've relied on thermal fuels to be able to provide that long, deep storage for those periods where we do go dry, and particularly with the role of gas being particularly challenging in New Zealand, that's one of the main energy transition issues for New Zealand, given that we can't just import energy.
What is the gas challenge, if you can elaborate on that, please?
Oh, put simply, it's that we're running out of it. We've long relied on the existing gas fields to provide gas, and we have one major off-taker that uses about 40% of that gas in Methanex to provide methanol. And so they've underpinned the gas industry in New Zealand for a long period of time by providing the security for the rest of the sector to be able to use gas. So it might surprise people, but actual gas usage for electricity generation in New Zealand is relatively small, very small. Domestic gas use is, again, very, very small. So most of it goes to these large industrial users. And so without them underpinning that gas supply, that becomes a challenge. And because we've had a situation of declining gas and no new major finds, we're in a situation now where, as we've just seen last winter, where it's been actually more profitable to provide that gas to other users than to use it for producing methanol. And that's a solution that's been good for New Zealand in the short term, but longer term is unlikely to be the solution. We're going to need to either start thinking about finding new gas supplies if we're going to continue to use gas, and that's again problematic from a if you're trying to achieve your emissions reductions targets, and that's the perennial discussion that we're having in New Zealand at the moment, how we do that. Or you're going to need to start thinking about maybe you should import gas. So that's a very active debate going on at the moment, whether we import gas through an LNG type facility.
Yeah.
So
well, certainly, I mean, importing it, again, bringing it all the way to the bottom of the world is quite an expensive proposition. And I'm just wondering if you're able to talk to these gas challenges a bit more here, because with, I believe it's the Taranaki gas fields that are often talked about in the media, and this idea that maybe they're running out. And I'm just wondering how that is couched with previous government policy around exploration. And I'm not too deep in that space. I hope you can share what you know. But what was the situation, and where is it at today in terms of new explorations and new gas fields opening up?
Yeah, it's a real active debate going on at the moment, and there's sort of two sides to the debate. There's one side that will say, it's the fact that the previous government introduced a ban on oil and gas exploration in New Zealand, and that's scared off the capital investment that's needed to continue to explore the gas and to continue to develop the existing gas assets in New Zealand. And then there's the other side of the debate that says, though, if you look at the gas permits for exploration, they were declining before the government's gas ban. No one had found anything. wasn't the policy that's created that issue. We need to get off fossil fuels if we're going to make, real inroads into our achieving our emissions reduction targets. So, we just need to draw a line in the sand. And so, those two debates are really active at the moment. And I guess the key point is, how are we going to provide certainty, I guess, for the holders of assets? For example, if you're talking about electricity generation, how are you going to provide certainty for the holders of those assets that they can continue to operate those assets and that they'll continue to be a life for those assets if they continue to invest in them for 25 years plus as we go through the transition. So it's one of those key points to say the reason why gas is important is for that reason that we can run out of hydro storage, and the types of generation that we're building tend to be intermittent renewable generation. So, if you look at a company like Mercury, it's got the largest wind farm development portfolio. Others are building wind farms. Solar is becoming more popular as well, and we're seeing the first grid-connected solar grid-scale farms come onto the grid. All of those depend on the wind blowing and the sun shining. Of course, they're not as firm as an option, and you'll hear this concept of firmness come through. An option is building a gas-fired generation plant which can come on very quickly and provide a lot of megawatts very quickly to meet those really cold days that we have, and also it can operate in a more sort of constant mode for those periods, which we often get in New Zealand where you don't have a lot of wind. So this is what happened to us early on in the year. You had this period where there wasn't really a lot of wind for a number of days, and we didn't have the hydro reserves in our hydro scheme. And so, the question was, what options did we have there apart from asking, prices were going very high in the market, which was signaling, hey, it's profitable for you to, turn off whatever you can to avoid those costs. So the market was kind of doing what it needed to do, but the challenge is, of course, that creates perceptions of a broken market.
Yeah, well, that's quite interesting to me, Nick, that, as you say, there's this intermittent load with solar and wind, and then the question of base load, which is something that perhaps the public are not too aware of. I think it's kind of a little bit like, you flick the switch and the light comes on, and there's this whole magic, really, of infrastructure and systems that power that. And it's kind of a complex topic, or at least there's a little bit of complexity which the general public are not aware of. And then when suddenly, in the middle of winter, you get into a situation where there's the possibility of blackouts and having to ask people to turn off, as well as high prices. There's things that are very counterproductive to a functional modern society. This is not what we would expect in New Zealand, and it sort of also has a lot of flow-on effects for industry as well. There's processes that can't be turned off, and there's things like hospitals and critical infrastructure, which leads to all sorts of questions about what people will do and this kind of fragility of the system. So maybe we can talk a little bit about baseload in New Zealand and sort of how it works, because again, as these long islands with load centres sort of very far away from a generation potentially, just broadly, how would you paint that picture?
In terms of what currently provides that sort of consistent baseload energy?
Yeah, I guess where are things at the moment? What's kind of the composition of the network?
Yeah, well, that's right. So you have predominantly thermal fuels and geothermal actually providing what we call baseload power. So within your thermal fuel fleet, you have thermal coal stations like Huntly, and to an extent gas can provide baseload as well, and Huntly can operate in both modes. It can burn both fuels. So it's a very flexible plant, and it's located in a great part of the grid as well, because it's, anyone who knows Huntly, close to Auckland, where a lot of your demand is. So, the grid is adequate to meet that demand. So, generally what has happened in the past is Huntly will turn on through winter and generate baseload electricity. It'll be operating in a baseload mode most of the year, and it has got some ability to ramp up and ramp down. Your geothermals will be operating in that consistent baseload as well. So a geothermal power station likes to be operating constantly. It doesn't like to be ramped up and ramped down, so in response to whatever the demand is on the network. But of course, meeting those peaks when it gets very cold in winter is what you need peaking plant for, which has predominantly been gas. stations and our hydro stations, providing that really instantaneous that peak load. So, broadly speaking, those technologies have been the ones that we've relied on, and increasingly have had to rely on. We've probably had to rely on coal a lot more to provide that base load, with the shortage of gas in particular. And then going forward, it's what are the technologies that are actually going to replace that? So Huntly, if you look at its roadmap, Genesis has got out its strategy around how it's going to start thinking about replacing those technologies, and it's looking at things like could you burn biofuels within Huntly? What are the roles of the sort of alternative fuels in that? But of course, all of those speak to have you got the supply chains for it, and what will the costs be?
Mm-hmm. Well, that question of supply chains is also very interesting because there seems to be, again, with these islands at the bottom of the world. I mean, even more broadly, the electrification question when it comes to petrol and oil imports and storage facilities and that whole supply chain, because the question of Marsden Point comes up, and the refinery and the ability to have sovereignty around hydrocarbons as well is really interesting. And so there's this kind of broader question, which I think maybe if we bring this back down into this policy background that you've got, from my perspective, I often think there's kind of what the government thinks, and what the state thinks, and then what the reality is, and what is the challenge here? Because energy is such a critical piece of everything that happens in a country and a civilization, yet it also feels like maybe we're sleepwalking towards this sovereignty challenge with energy, and its sort of policy is pushing it in different directions. So broadly, how would you sort of connect policy and then kind of reality, and sort of how they connect?
Yeah, I think ultimately New Zealand's in a really great position to have energy independence, right, and to realise energy sovereignty, and that's through the electrification of the economy. So, I think it's pretty clear that the policy settings and where the government wants to get to, and particularly with the net carbon zero targets that we have by 2050, they are quite clearly signalling that we need to double our renewable electricity generation. So that's the main challenge, if you're thinking about like energy sovereignty, because we want to get off our reliance on importing fossil fuels, right? So we predominantly import fossil fuels for the like of for our transport fleet. And our ability to be able to decarbonise that will be a major source of demand for electricity, right? And we're lucky in that we've got a renewable pipeline that is very, very healthy. So companies like Mercury, Contact, Meridian, the big players have all got enough consents, and the analysis is out there. The regulators have put this out there, and the industry's put it out there. There's plenty of options to develop and to build more renewables to meet demand. So what you generally tend to find that the biggest challenges is that when you look at the graphs, you have this nice sort of linear graph that goes from now to 2050, which shows here's where we will need to get to, and it'll be a nice smooth transition. And the reality is that it's transitions never look like that. They're a big squiggly line that go up and down, up and down, up and down until you get to that point. And we're in that up and down, up and down, up and down world at the moment now, where we're moving to a point where we're building a lot of renewable electricity, but it's creating real challenges in terms of security of supply and reliability, really, of the system, because we're relying more on weather-dependent renewables as we go through time.
Yeah.
And that is creating this challenge of, what's going to be able to replace the role that fossil fuels have played, because we're displacing those. And that's what you want to see, an energy system. You want to see an energy system displace your fossil fuels from the system, but that's creating other challenges in terms of security and reliability. Mm-hmm. So, the opportunity is clear for New Zealand. We need to get off fossil fuels for our process heat as well as transport. So, Fonterra burns a lot of coal. We need to get them using electricity in their boilers. We need other processes to use electricity in the country. And the real challenge is, are we going to be able to be able to build the renewables at a cheap enough cost to be able to create the demand for those sorts of products, or the
Mm.
demand from those sectors to be able to sustainably transition. So.
Mm. Well, just pulling on that a bit, because I mean, I think there's a bit that's kind of encapsulated in this idea of the 2050 thing, the decarbonisation thing, and again, this is something that the public maybe isn't really aware of. They maybe heard some of the buzzwords floating around, but the idea that there's going to be this electric transition, this electrification of everything, and that this is being led by government who do they really understand what's going on? Is there sort of a role here in terms of communicating and actually bringing the public and citizens and businesses on board? And how does that look? I mean, because I know the energy sector in New Zealand is quite connected with government, but though it is separate, and these are publicly traded companies, and so I mean, broadly, how do we see the connection between what the government thinks is the right thing, which is not always the case, and the public and private sector kind of making things happen?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I do think that one of the key parts of my role, and I think the key my previous role was really about how you build that connection, right? So how do you communicate what it is that the industry needs in terms of policy settings to support that transition? And then what's the role for governments, regulators, the sector more broadly to play? So, and then also, as you correctly pointed out, do the public understand kind of the current state of play? I still think you still tend to hear, I still think the sector needs to do a much better job, and probably the government needs to as well, about where we're actually at, like what the progresses that we're actually making, because we are on track in terms of building enough renewables to meet that demand, the forecast demand to meet our 2050 targets. But yet I don't know that there'd be a lot of, I think when people see the fact that we've got energy shortages, I think we're not building enough electricity for generation, for example. They don't really fully appreciate that this is a issue due to a fuel supply issue, rather than an actual fact that we're not building enough generation to meet the overall energy demand. Basically, we need to build a lot more renewables, but the problem we're going to have is how do we shift those renewables into those periods that we actually need them to be in. So those winter period, peak periods. How do we shift that energy around that we're building? Or equally, how do we send really clear price signals and incentives to people who might have capacity to reduce their demand, and that could be households as well, to reward you for the fact that you might, run your battery or whatever you have, or whatever distributed energy resource you have over those peak periods, rather than rely on the grid. So, there's a lot of work being done now. Like there's a lot of trials going on in the industry. And another client that I'm working with at the moment is doing a lot of trials with retailers around how they can control hot water load within your home, and provide incentives for consumers to allow your retailers to control that at those periods when we might have peak load demands on the network. So all of that innovation is actually really going to be really important for our transition as well.
Yeah, well, I guess to be a bit more straight up about it, we've got this innovation happening at the edges. There's interesting things, but again, there was the risk of blackouts earlier in the year, and there's just challenges, which again isn't something that should be expected from a developed economy. And it seems as if New Zealand tends to look towards government, this kind of give us leadership. And energy is one of these funny places where it kind of does rely on a lot of policy, and there's a lot of kind of interconnection between what can be done in the private sector and what the policy is. And so there's this kind of challenge where, again, the government is setting strategy and it's making these bold claims for something like an energy transition, which actually has an impact on everybody. And so we could just dwell on this for a moment, but how does this work? Because with any other sector, generally the market drives change, and people can decide what happens. But with energy in particular, it's one of these things that kind of relies on policy, and there's a lot of regulation. You can't just start up and build a power station. There's a lot of consenting, all these kinds of things. And it just seems like the default argument in the media that is never challenged is, what is the government doing here, setting these targets? And do they even know what they're doing? And that's a question I'll put to you. Like, what is the level of competence from government and advisors? Do they really understand, when we're getting this close to blackouts, that there's actually a real impact on people here?
Oh, look, I mean, yeah, they do, and I think this is the transition, and the reality of the transition, which I was trying to articulate. It's not the nice straight line, right? So, to be clear, I think the issues that we're going through in the sector will be resolved. Like the solutions will be found, and in the short term, for example, the difference that we'll have this year compared to next year is we've got about 300 megawatts of batteries that will come online. We've got solar farms that'll be operating over those peak periods that weren't operating before. This is the great thing about the industry is it's very dynamic, right? Like because you've had a situation of challenge doesn't mean that is the people tend to extrapolate and go, well, now every year we're just going to have blackouts and it's going to be like a third world country and that's not good enough. It certainly is the case that there's challenges, and we've seen those writ large. And I guess the main challenge for government and for the industry is to just not knee jerk into solutions that, so-called solutions that are politically acceptable but don't actually really address the problem, right? Like, is it a competition? One hand of the argument, people will say it's a competition issue. You need to have more competition. Other people will say, you know, you can go down that route, but it's a fuel supply issue. So what are we going to do about the gas transition? How are we going to provide certainty that batteries will come in and solve some of the problems? Some of that longer duration piece will be a bit more challenging, but the industry will work it out. And history has shown us this. I mean, when you're around in the sector long enough, you sort of see these sorts of things come and go. We were in exactly the same situation 20 years ago, right? I mean, you may not be aware, but government, there were papers up to cabinet at that time talking about importing LNG because we'd had a very dry winter, we'd had very high prices. The Jerry Brownlee led a reform process in the national government at the time to do a big review of what we're doing, exactly what we're doing now. There was an underwrite for a gas generation plant at Huntley and E3P, and effectively that meant that we didn't import LNG. So, solutions kind of get found to these problems that come around. This is no different to situations that we've been in the past, and I believe the market will eventually solve it. But it's going to be messy, and it's going to be challenging. And I don't see that there's a role. I think government absolutely understands the challenges, but they also know that they don't want to have a role in kind of interfering in the market and potentially stifling that investment that is going to happen that will eventually help to solve some of these challenges.
Yeah,
But
well,
from an outside perspective, I can fully appreciate where people go, well, this doesn't look like anyone's got their hands on the wheels.
yeah, well, I just again, I do think New Zealand is in an interesting case where there is this kind of big government, even though it is a relatively small country, and we often seem to be looking to the government for the answers, which I sort of instantly it makes my gut turn a little bit. And I think where is the competency, and the solution will work itself out, but again, with something as critical as energy, is there, is it worth putting to chance? And I can only trust that there's competent people working in the generators and in the market who can actually push back, because the challenge is when you get a political solution emerge, and we've seen there was sort of murmurs around price controls and these kinds of things, and people, the short-termism of government talking about something that they're not going to be around for, and so they can make knee-jerk changes for political purposes. And this is the constant struggle that you've got, government in for a few years, and they can make promises that appeal to the voters now, but ultimately, longer term, it undermines the integrity of the nation. And I think this is something maybe we're sort of, you talk about Jerry Brownlee's work 20 years ago, and, sort of we've seen again and again these political maneuverings, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And I just wonder how that affects maybe the public perception as well, because the government should do something about it, is the call that we hear.
Yeah,
and then
right.
Sometimes that doesn't really make a solution,
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, that is the perennial issue that you're always trying to deal with, right? Is to go, how do we get sensible policy that accepts that, I'll be the first one to admit no market is ever perfect, right? Like you're always needing to make tweaks, you're always needing to evolve it. And, the Brownlee reforms I think were a really great example there, where when I first came into the industry, people were going, well, I can't believe there are actually some pretty big changes that were made, like virtual asset swaps to, try and produce more competition between the big players. There were penalties put in place, compensation payments that had to be made by retailers to their customers if we went dry. And all of these things were seen as particularly for a market-led government, as national as seen to be. They were sort of seen to be reaching quite deeply into the market, but and also the establishment of a hedge market. But I think when you look back on those periods, you realise that those actual reforms were things that helped people to shift their perceptions and move forwards. So I do think there's this healthy tension. Like I'm sort of almost loath to sort of go, yes, government always gets it wrong, and only industry knows what's best. I think there's this tension that emerges between. There does come a point where industry hasn't got the ability to be able to come together to solve some of the bigger issues. And I think the gas transition is a classic example of this right now, right? So, we need to just be able to provide some certainty to people that they can continue to invest in these assets, and that they're not going to have stranded assets on their balance sheets, right? Putting aside for 1 minute whether we think that gas is, the environmental impact of it, I mean, that's a separate debate. But, if you're just looking at security at the moment, and the conversation we've been having is that people would have a reasonable expectation that we keep the lights on. And gas is an essential part of that mix at the moment. But, we're really stuck in this conversation that no one in the industry can resolve bilaterally or collectively. And there have been attempts to do it through contracts. For example, Genesis has been out there with contracts in the market saying, hey, we can provide you with power over these periods, to provide a firming product. And there are a lot of players who have been saying the market's broken and not working, who haven't bid in for those products, right? When the market has clearly offered them, and they're exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. People who could be hedged and who don't need to go out of business but aren't taking up those products. So you kind of look at it and go, the products, it's not a lack of availability of the product in the market. There must be something else going on. So the ability for the industry to kind of resolve these issues is can be really challenging, right? Because each individual's incentive, we want people to not collude. We don't want people to work together, but some of these solutions because it's a competitive market, but some of these solutions need us to come together to go, actually, what's the best solve for New Zealand? And sometimes you can only do that through processes like what Brownlee went through, and also what the government's probably going to go through now. There's always a risk that you come out with some ideas that are not great, but there's this tension that it sort of builds up in the industry, and then it has to be released somehow, I think. And so everyone will be focused very much on trying to get some sensible policy options into that debate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm certainly open to exploring the idea that with something, again, like energy, which kind of impacts everything, it sort of sits along, national defence or something like that in terms of the level of reach, the kind of national responsibility. And this is certainly something that I'm interested to learn more about in terms of the strategic approach to something like this, because I know in other countries you've got, public owned infrastructure and utilities, fully directed from the top. In other places, you've got fully independent, private sector led, kind of leave me alone type of strategy. And so there's these maybe different models. And I guess I'm willing to learn about the different ways that you could approach this. And given your experience working in the UK, Australia, different places, I mean, how would you compare and contrast models broadly towards energy and policy?
Yeah, you generally tend, in terms of market design, you generally tend to have two different types. And one's called an energy-only market, and then one's called a capacity market. And in New Zealand and Australia, although Australia's moving more towards more of a sort of regulated, controlled market, in different parts of the world, you have we run an energy-only market, and effectively what an energy-only market says is that everything's in the price, right? So you simply have a pool where everyone bids into, and you just try and dispatch the least cost generation to meet demand at any given point. And that means that if you're a generator that requires, like for example, a peaking generator, you are only going to be dispatched in those periods when you're really needed. So the rest of the time, you're going to have to cover your costs through payments that might not actually really cover your long run marginal costs, to use an economics term. And so what that leads to, that is economists really like that, because it's very transparent, and it's kind of least cost dispatch. So you're always making sure that you've got, you're sending the right signals for the least cost generation at any given point in time to be dispatched. The big challenge that you've got is that, in those periods where it's really needed, the price can go very, very high. And it also can create challenges like we've seen recently, and we've seen throughout the debate within New Zealand is how do I, what incentive do I have to keep to maintain this asset? So if I've got a peaking generation plant in New Zealand at the moment, I've just got to keep it warm and keep it running and keep it going for that period where I'm going to be needed, and then I make my money. And for a lot of companies, it's becoming harder and harder to do that because they look at it and say, well, I have this ESG requirement where people don't want me holding these assets. These assets are very old now. Like I'm not going to build a new plant because I don't know that I've got the certainty of a 25-year return on that asset. So you're in this really challenging environment where, on the one hand, like if I play back the arguments I was hearing you talking about where people would have reasonable expectations that we keep the lights on and that these companies then operate these assets. On the other hand, they get, a lot of criticism for holding those assets and saying, well, why are you continuing to invest in gas when we know that the future has to be renewables? Like, you shouldn't be holding these assets. I don't want to invest in your company. So there's this tension that we're asking these companies to kind of, do everything. And yet we're not providing them with any kind of certainty around returns or why would they do that? So, legitimately they face these challenges from their investors to go, well, why are you continuing to hold these assets? And they go, well, if I don't, it's lights out for New Zealand, then we don't have an energy market, So I think these are the tensions that people don't really fully appreciate in terms of the challenges that these companies have to navigate, right? And it's very easy to just say, well, they made a lot of money, they should just suck it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and invariably we just get to these polarized arguments, right, which really don't help the understanding of the challenge.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's nuance to it.
Yeah, there's real nuance to it, right?
Yeah. And this is interesting. Just so with this energy only market approach, yep, everything encapsulated in the price. I imagine then that's where the role of power purchasing agreements and having contracts in place to turn off, to get paid to turn off, these kinds of things play. And can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, so basically everything's in the price. So participants will enter into hedge contracts to effectively insulate themselves from that price, right? So you agree an agreement whereby a swap contract effectively to ensure that you only face an average price. And that's what a retailer will do for you, right? Like, so an electricity retailer, they sell you a fixed price variable volume product. So you can use it. You can use as much as you like of that product for a fixed price, right? And that's all they're doing is they're just saying, doesn't matter what the volatility is in that spot market price, you'll only ever pay 25 cents a kilowatt hour, even though the price may go to 1,000 or whatever. I'll manage that for you, and you pay me, and I pay you, and so people don't. As a consumer, you don't really see that, right? You're just like, great, I've got a fixed price. I'm happy with that. And by and large, that kind of works. Like it's fine. Where it's become problematic, for the larger end of town, they will enter into, they may enter into much longer duration supply contracts, and they may underwrite. They may say, "I'll take the output from a new power station for a long period of time to get a really good and get a really good low cost of average energy for themselves." But what you increasingly find in New Zealand is that it's becoming more and more challenging for a lot of businesses to really enter into those long-term contracts. So they're tending to either ride the shorter term exposure to that spot price, or enter into very short duration contracts of a year or less. And like you might do with your own mortgage, right? You might take a view that mortgage rates are going to come down. I don't want to fix for 5 years. I'm going to go for a shorter duration. And I think generally what appears to be happening in New Zealand, particularly with a lot of large industrials too, is that I think it's quite challenging for them to commit to long-term tenures because a lot of them may not be owned by New Zealand interests. They may be part of a portfolio of companies globally, and their owners will look at it and say, well, I don't know really whether or not we will be operating in New Zealand in 10 years. So, I'm not going to contract to get you the lowest cost possible energy only. I want you to try and, manage with what you've got. So, that can create real challenges, I think, for the sustainability of those businesses. And then when you get into a situation where you have these really high price energy events and you're not hedged, that can be a real problem.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And for me, someone outside of this industry, Nick, it stands out that there's certainly a lot of complexity, and I've explored some of the things we've talked about before, and I'm aware of some of them, but it's sort of certainly to expect the public to appreciate that and to be able to soundbite that is very challenging. And it seems like maybe the thing that's missing amongst all of that, which is again what we started this conversation with, is the flexibility. Because again, with the move towards solar and wind, the increased build out of renewable energy, that question of flexibility comes up. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that, what the flexible options are. You mentioned there's a battery build out that's just happened, 300 megawatts. But broadly, let's talk about flexibility. What are the options and what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, so you can think about it from the supply side and the demand side, right? So the flexible forms of generation that we have are like hydro. So hydro is able, by determining how much water actually goes through your penstock and to your turbines, you can ramp up and down according to what demand is on the network. And hydro plays a really important role in New Zealand. 60% of our generation is hydro. So and most of that is very flexible. Equally, gas, as I've mentioned, is just a big gas turbine like you'd find on the outside of a jet plane. You just blast a lot of gas through that and you can create megawatts very quickly. Batteries are very good at providing very, very fast response time. So, battery is not a form of generation, of course, it's just a storage. So, you need to have generated something from some other source of generation.
You can shift
to feed
it,
the
though.
battery, right? Yeah, but that allows you to shift it through time. And the hydros do exactly the same thing. So, when you think about the challenges for a lot of jurisdictions, they're building a lot of intermittent renewable generation, but they don't have the storage that we have in our hydro lakes. So now they're having to face the challenge of building lots of battery storage to kind of move that energy around, right? And it's the same issue for us a little bit because when our hydros go dry, then we're in the same sort of situation. But by and large, we've got inherent storage in our system. We've got quite a bit of it, and that allows us to build these new intermittent renewables. So there's flexibility on that generation side through batteries, which are helpful. And then on the demand side, of course, flexibility is about contracts that you could enter into to effectively not consume energy at particular periods. So if you look at the smelter, the aluminium smelter, NZAS has entered into a contract as part of its recent negotiations with the industry, particularly through Meridian, for energy supply. And part of that contract was to, ramp down its production. And, if Meridian notifies that there's going to be a shortfall or whatever, I can't remember what the actual limits are, but it's reasonably chunky. And I believe that there are other industrials as well. I think New Zealand Steel has a arrangement that was negotiated as part of its some investment from the government fund that it received a while ago. Part of that arrangement included flexibility arrangement, which is really important. So these are when we were talking about the challenges that New Zealand faces, what people don't see is some of these arrangements that have come in, and that's actually played a really critical role in terms of shoring up the industry. And then there's actual but the problem is that people don't see that, right? So they don't see when that successfully gets brought into play that we avoided a shortfall situation. The other point that I would note about the shortfall situations for people is that there's a lot of worry and concern around shortfall, and we hear now it's quite commonplace in the news to say, hey, Transpower's issued a notification to the network that thinks it might be a shortfall this evening. Those notifications have always happened and they've always come out. It's only because we've had an incident that people suddenly have gone, look at these notifications. We were having this all the time. So I think this is a perception issue as well around some of the shortfall situations. The shortfall situation generally means that we're reaching a threshold whereby we still have quite a lot of reserve and to go, that we're not going to go dark. And some of the challenges that we've had is just because of not so much that we've run out of fuel or we haven't had the fuel in supply. There's been things that have just broken in the system, and it's been a bit of a sort of a confluence of events that have all happened at the same time, a sort of a black swan event, if you will, rather than an actual, hey, we just haven't invested enough, or the stuff that we've got is not working right.
Yeah. Well, just thank you for that. And I guess a tack that I want to explore now with you is just coming back to this idea of Bitcoin mining, which we talked about a little bit before offline. And I guess starting off, how aware are you of the space? What is your understanding of Bitcoin as it stands?
Yeah, very little. So I'm just the most excited for, I think, rather than me wittering on, actually hearing from someone with your experience and expertise in this, because one of the things around flexibility that I didn't sort of talk about was, the ability for server demand, for instance. That's been a big source of demand for New Zealand, which has been really exciting. I know it's been probably the highlight for what has been otherwise a very dim outlook for demand in New Zealand. So we focus a lot on supply. A lot of our policies focus on how can we get more renewable generation. We don't really have a lot of policies that look at how do we build demand in New Zealand. And the fact that we've seen interest from Amazon Web Services and Microsoft and the like to build actually reasonably chunky servers in New Zealand has been a real it's been really exciting for the sector, I think, to see that sort of demand. And what I was going to say is actually the great thing about that demand is that it is flexible, because generally what you find is that when someone comes and says, hey, I want to get a supply contract from you, they want a very firm contract, right? So they want you to firm that output for them to make sure that they're not exposed to any volatility in that wholesale price. And that means that you've got to use your flexible hydro resources to be able to provide that, firm power output for when those companies require it. And that's higher cost. It just speaks to cost, right? So the contract, if you came to me and said, hey, I just want to get contract and I just want the power anytime, it doesn't need to be over peaks, I don't worry about peaks. I can manage that myself. I can give you a much more competitive price for that energy than if you said, actually, I need you to make sure that I pay the same price no matter when I use it, right? And that's a situation, like I said before, that fixed price variable volume that we have to apply to households. And that's what makes a householder, actually, the cost to serve for a householder for an electricity retailer is a lot higher. So the beauty of server demand is that, of course, they can flex their demand depending on where their server loads are globally. So when we talked about New Zealand being isolated, actually server demand is an awesome outcome for the New Zealand industry, for the electricity generation sector, because they say, hey, we just like the fact that it's green. It's great. Give us as much as you can, and let us worry about those peak periods, because what we'll do is just throttle down our server demand. We'll just use it in Australia or wherever out of our global system, and we'll manage that risk. So just give us the cheapest cost, and happy days. So that's a really great thing for the sector. And I think my limited understanding of Bitcoin mining is that it does seem to be inherently flexible in that same way. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, so I think I'd probably contrast it a little bit with data centers in the sense that it can be turned off instantly, and you can turn the whole thing off and it won't make a huge difference. Whereas I think with servers there are, and high performance compute, there is an expectation that it is on and available. Otherwise, you're going to be eroding the value of that site, because these are extremely expensive, for data centers. There's extremely expensive investments, and to be turning it off willy-nilly isn't really an option. Whereas I would contrast that with Bitcoin mining, and I'll share what I know in a moment, but it really can just be turned off with a switch, and because of the nature of the hashing process that's taking place. And so if I can broadly paint a picture of what I know, and what I think would be interesting is then to connect this with what you know about energy and grids. Bitcoin mining, if you think of it it's basically these shoe boxes that they do one thing and one thing only. It's the hashing function, and they do this, billions of times a second, these machines. And really, all you need to feed them is power and a relatively low bandwidth internet connection. They don't require that much data. They do need data from, they need to connect to the internet, but it doesn't require the fat, tier 1 internet that you need for a data center. So they can be anywhere. And they're also relatively durable in the sense that they can be as simple as a single one of these single shoe boxes in a room or in a container. They're not as sensitive, I guess, as a high performance compute center or a data center, and so they can be moved around quite a lot. And effectively, the interesting thing for the grid, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this, is number one, it's an intermittent load, so it really can just be turned off instantly, turned back on as required. And secondly, there's actually an economic output because you're mining Bitcoin, which is a digital currency. It's got value. It's got economic value. Just yesterday, the value of a single Bitcoin hit $100,000 US, and so we've seen this massive growth in the industry, this massive increase in value as Bitcoin monetizes into a currency that's being used by more and more people. And so there's this really interesting situation where you can have an asset that's maybe not connected to the grid, it can be making money without actually being plugged in to the national network. And this is a really interesting game changer, which I just don't know how much. I don't think there's anything else that does that, Nick. And so it's kind of this kind of elixir for the grid, which more and more people are beginning to explore. And certainly I'm very interested in this space. But I mean, a Bitcoin mining site that can be plugged in anywhere at any time, you can kind of model the income and the revenue of that site because it's making money through mining Bitcoin. But it can also play a role in some of these contracts and PPAs that you're discussing, where you can get paid to turn off, and you can move it around. These containers can be picked up and moved relatively easily. So there's kind of a few factors there. So happy to take questions from what I know, my humble knowledge, or maybe throw it to you, how you see that maybe impacting the grid.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, if I take it back to what we're trying to achieve in New Zealand, and that is, the rapid build out of as much renewable electricity as we can. I haven't even touched on AI power demand, because when I talked about the 50% increase in renewable electricity we need by 2050, in New Zealand that doesn't even take into account the fact that US server demand looks like it's going to go from 3 to 16% in the next 6 years just because of AI alone, right? How do we think about that in New Zealand? So I think when I look at that, when I hear what you're talking about too, there's definitely going to be more demand for as much renewable electricity as we can get onto the grid everywhere in the world, and New Zealand will be. I don't think New Zealand will be any different. And you already have a lot of projects that are looking for large offtake, demand to underwrite those investments, to ensure that they have the stable cash flows to be able to know for certain that you're going to get a return on that asset, right? I mean, you can sell it into the wholesale market, which is obviously what you do, but then you run the risk of the volatility of that market. Ideally, what you find is with the large players, they're inherently conservative, right? They're not looking to make the most money out of their investment. They're just making to look at a stable return. The utility shares, they trade at a reasonable rate on the stock market. They're not going to be technology shares. Are not going to be valued at those kind of levels. They're just expected to provide a reasonable rate of return. So anything that can underwrite those revenues in that market by providing a stable sort of source of demand, but also being able to provide some flexibility so that to that point, I don't have to provide you with firming because you can actually manage that risk, I think is inherently attractive.
Well, if I can ask you something, so again, from the outside of the industry, my feeling is that by being able to say, look, if we drop in 2 shipping containers, or we build a small we build a small site on site behind the meter, you can factor that into the planning and the financing of a project. From my perspective, given that it may take a period of time to connect to the grid, and I'd love to know what that might be from your perspective, from your experience, but you've got some far rural site, wind, solar, whatever. It's going to take a bit of time to connect to the grid, and in the meantime, though, you can have this thing behind the meter. You can drop it off with a truck, and it's going to start making money. And it's going to be making very good, valuable money. I mean, how do you see that dynamic playing out?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I'd be interested to understand. Is that something that you see playing out overseas? Is that generally how this technology is being deployed?
It's interesting in that, from my experience, there's a lot of different ways it can work. There's stranded assets that can be monetized. There's new sites that it could be built alongside with. And then there's just people who are, mining it at market rates. There's quite a lot of different people, and pretty much the only thing they have in common is that they're all using these Bitcoin mining machines. But the business models are very broad, and because it's, I guess, from my study and my experience with this, the industry is still very nascent. This kind of commercial level Bitcoin mining has only been really a few years, and so there's kind of a real, and maybe we can loop this back to some of your innovation work. But for me, it's like, man, there's this machine that you can plug in anywhere, and if you've got cheap power, it will make you more money. And that's kind of a magical thing that doesn't really exist anywhere else. And we haven't really fully explored what that means yet, I think, globally. And so there's this kind of opportunity to use that and innovate with that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly connection times can be a factor.
I mean,
Definitely for these
what's yeah,
larger.
rural wind, rural solar. I mean, what sort of are we talking months or years or like what's the
I
connection
mean,
time?
it depends. Short answer is we wouldn't be able to give you an exact figure, but it depends on the size of because obviously clearly a smaller wind farm will have, or a smaller solar farm will have, less demands on the grid. Mostly people are trying to locate these. Your ideal is that you're locating it in an area where there is, either sufficient capacity, and that you're going to have to spend the minimum amount to try and connect it to the grid. But in some parts of the grid, you might be looking at it saying, "Well, I know I'm going to be putting maybe a couple of wind farms in this area, so I'm prepared to pay to augment the grid facilities or the connection facilities to quite a high level to put some more capacity in there, knowing that I'm going to be building some other stuff in the region." I won't go into the sort of vagaries of the connection agreements and arrangements because it is actually quite complex. But it can take some period of time, like it can take years to kind of get it. I mean, getting consents and getting everything done for a wind farm can take a decade, right? Like, so, it would depend on the sequencing of how things go. So, my initial reaction would be you probably do have a period of commissioning whereby you wouldn't be producing power into the grid, but that generally tends to be reasonably short. It's not, it's maybe a couple of months rather than years type thing. Because ideally you want to have everything up and running and connected to the grid as quickly as possible. And you'll connect things in stages as well, right? So, you won't have the whole farm up and running. You might have, half of it, a third, then you commission the other half and get it going in stages. So it definitely sounds like there'd be potential for something like that. And I certainly agree if you want to get the lowest cost of energy, you'd want it to be closest to to on the site itself, because otherwise you're having to pay for transmission and distribution costs in terms
Yeah,
of transmitting that electricity, which, to give you some idea, it's roughly about a third, a third, a third, right? So, you can produce electricity reasonably cheaply. A wind farm will be around 8 cents a kilowatt hour, eight to 10 cents a kilowatt hour, at site.
yeah. Well, I guess again it's quite interesting because there's this established energy grid in New Zealand. There's a lot of players, a lot of a lot of policy and regulation, and then there's this new thing of Bitcoin mining, which it's unfortunate that there is maybe public misconceptions about what Bitcoin is and what Bitcoin
Mm,
mining is. It's sort of that's a challenge that we're having to deal with. But beyond that, the opportunity for innovation, because again, this is a very valuable digital asset that's being
mm,
produced by these Bitcoin miners, and they have this again almost magical ability to be the buyer of first resort and also the buyer of last resort, because they'll take any energy, give me cheap power, I'll turn off if you need me to,
mm,
I'll go wherever you need me to. I can just do with a Starlink, basic, literally a container and a Starlink, and you're good to go. It's very flexible. It's very scalable. You can have one machine or you can have 5,000 machines. It's kind of got some interesting attributes which haven't fully been appreciated, because I think on the again on the public side, the mass media is sort of having their go at it and not really appreciating what this means, and the kind of the whole story of Bitcoin itself as a inflation resistant money, etc., etc. There's a whole story there which again people aren't aware of, and so there's actually a real opportunity that I see for these Bitcoin miners to operate, to bring some self-sovereignty to local communities as well. And so something you were talking about earlier with the geothermal, a lot of this is iwi land, Maori land. And so actually having something there, a demand centre that can be making money. It's not just making a product or a commodity. It's actually making money, and plugging that in actually can bring a lot of self-sovereignty. So there's a lot of moving parts, and there's not
mm.
that many people talking about this in New Zealand. There is a few of us, but I mean, certainly from what we've talked about today, and it seems like maybe it's kind of a new topic for you, but I mean, what's your general feeling about what this could mean, and sort of maybe the innovation opportunities?
Yeah, I do agree. I think you're going to be. It's a little bit like our earlier conversation and trying to explain the intricacies of how an electricity market works. Like most people are just inclined to take this soundbite, right? That it just
Yeah,
doesn't work and we need to do something about it. I think Bitcoin is often the same thing. You quite rightly point out. People's perception of it, public perception of it, might not meet the actual reality of what the actual technology is capable of doing and achieving. So there's that public perception piece that would need to be addressed. Like what would it look like if a major entity, publicly listed entity in New Zealand, sort of announced that it was getting into Bitcoin mining? I don't know I don't know the answer to that. Whether what the shareholder reaction would be, or whether like I mentioned, people that tend to hold the stock tend to be inherently conservative. They're looking for a consistent return. They're not looking for outsized returns. They just want a stable kind of stream of return. So, I think the flexibility of the technology is inherently attractive, right? Putting aside the public perception of Bitcoin, I think the actual technical capabilities that you've just described and what it's able to do is inherently, I think, valuable, and particularly in a market where I just mentioned, like we're in the short term, we have to make some pretty big decisions about like, well, what is going to be the thing that provides that flexibility, and the only thing that I can see that you can flex in the short term is demand. And whether that's through providing better pricing to householders to use energy at different times, or to directly control their loads like their EV charging or their hot water load control, which we're sort of saying there's a lot of demand in that system existing that could flex. And I would put Bitcoin mining in that kind of same box, right? I did ahead of this, did do a little bit of sort of AI searching around just to get an idea, and I see that Texas has done some stuff there. Are you able to talk at all a
Yeah,
bit more
well, I
about
mean,
that?
I can give you a New Zealand example.
Oh, okay.
So when we were having that period earlier in the year where there was the challenges with the electrical, the potential of a blackout, actually, there's a company in the South Island at Monowai called Grid Share who are Bitcoin mining, and I'm a customer of theirs, and we turned off for that whole period. So we curtailed, and they have an agreement with the generator there to curtail. And, we did our bit. We turned off and we let that electricity flow into the national grid. And so that's a small example, and it's, for New Zealand, I think it's a really awesome case study. But those guys are doing awesome work. So that's a company, GridShare. And I think there's a lot of opportunities that exist like that in New Zealand, where a PPA, a power purchasing agreement, could be in place. There could be some contracts where you turn off to curtail, and when you're not turned off, you're making the world's hardest money, inflation resistant money, and then when the needs of the grid exceed the price of that, then you turn off and you let that energy flow. So that's a real example that happened this year, and I think that's pretty awesome to see that innovation in New Zealand. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in that respect, I think the mining operations are probably not that too dissimilar to most loads on the network, right? Like, I don't think there would be any reason why a renewable electricity generator would not want someone with that inherent flexibility as part of their portfolio, right? I don't know whether they're the natural owners of the technology itself, and I don't know that I would see people probably directly investing in it, but they would probably be quite keen to see that industry grow as a source of demand, absolutely. And, being able to contract with a flexible load would have inherent advantages in terms of balancing their own portfolio. In this, as I've painted out, this kind of flexibility constrained world that we're in at the moment.
Nick, I was just going to say though, I talk to a lot of people about this who are certainly more closer to the tech than me, and who are working more closely in the space. I mean, as I say, I'm a customer of this particular company, but and I talk to a lot of people. But from your perspective, in the New Zealand situation, where should this conversation be happening, and who should we as Bitcoiners and Bitcoin miners, who should we be talking to make this aware that this is the kind of stuff that can be used in New Zealand for the best benefit of the grid and for everyone effectively, and that this is a real opportunity for innovation for New Zealand? Who should we be talking to? What are the forums?
Yeah, I mean, there are many forums, but I think the thing that you want to be doing is providing as much information as you can out there. That case study that you just provided, I think, would be really, really useful to be able to pull together, to be able to say, hey, look, this is how this technology can be used. This is the response times that it can kind of provide. The fact that you're sort of saying you can go almost instantaneously off, you don't have to ramp down in any kind of way. I would say that the main entities that would be particularly interested in, if you haven't already spoken to them, would be someone like who operates the power system itself. So, the Transpower is an entity that both owns and operates the grid. and to the system operator function, and they are always looking at ways in which there can be, they've looked at the past in terms of how you develop flexibility markets as well. So some of the processes that are happening that they've had in the past have looked at, like how do we actually remunerate and provide incentives for people to be rewarded for dropping their load and for providing benefits back to the system. This is actually part of the debate that's going on at the moment. I don't know how closely you've been following some of the reform processes that are coming out, but if you look at the package of reforms from the Energy Task Force that's around there, the package 2 reforms are all looking at this area of, how do we reward loads for effectively providing flexibility into the market. And there's something called the Flexibility Forum as well that is a grouping of it's a group of flexibility providers and industry participants that are coming together to go, like, how do we actually get some visibility around what does the opportunity look like? What do the policy settings need to look like to encourage flexibility? How do we need to work collectively together to provide the protocols in which flexibility can be integrated better into the market? So there's a lot of stuff that's happening through various forums, and things like the Business Energy Council as well of New Zealand. If you haven't come across them, they're a really great Wellington-based sort of body that can help, provide. And they're really interested in sort of innovative new ways of doing things and providing that link into policymakers. But I would be directly engaging as well. I mean, New Zealand's a small place, which is one of the great things about it, is that, you literally can, get the address of a policy advisor into the Minister of Energy, or to, I'd be talking to the science and innovation people as well at MB, as well as, the Minister for Science and Innovation across those portfolios, and saying, these are real opportunities for us to, scale and grow these things.
Yeah.
Is it how is the innovation piece developing and growing overseas? I mean, who's typically investing in these technologies? Do you see, venture capital getting involved in it? Like, what is is it just mostly enthusiasts, or people who are like really, really keen on the tech and are trying to test it and push its boundaries? Like, paint a picture of the ecosystem for me.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what's interesting is, again, it's an open network, and in fact, you probably see there's this little box just on my shelf here. So it's a small kind of Bitcoin miner. It's called a BitAxe, and that is just a tiny little demo machine that I use for people. But you've got stuff like that all the way through to, in places like Texas, you've got these facilities that have got thousands of machines that are operating at the cutting edge of technology. There's capital funds coming in and helping build these things up and stand them up. And it's quite, again, there's a very broad scale of opportunities. I mean, I'm personally mining myself. There's sort of lots of different scales, and so that's something that's interesting, is that it really is quite scalable. And you've got venture funds coming in. You've got people doing it as part of integrated business structure. Maybe they do some other Bitcoin related things, and they want to have the Bitcoin mining capacity so they can make sure their transactions are always going to go through. So there's kind of lots of different models that are emerging. And it's kind of, again, early days, but the real disruptive thing, and I think maybe the change that's happening pretty much right now, is that we have been in a period where there's been a bit of uncertainty about Bitcoin at a high level. But given the outcomes of the US election, and that's been reflected in market stability, people now have confidence that the US is heading on the right path, and the value of Bitcoin and the exchange rate value of a Bitcoin has gone up incredibly in the last few weeks.
Very high, yeah. I've seen that.
So, though, I mean, there is questions of volatility, but effectively it's monetizing into a global reserve currency that can be used by anybody. And so there's this really interesting political dynamic, which I think maybe a year or two ago it would have been a little bit more challenging to talk to people, but I mean, certainly I'm having people come to me now and wanting to talk about Bitcoin. And I guess for us, we're non-state aligned. Bitcoin is, like to be able to do their own thing. And so we're sort of in this interesting place where, well, now is actually an opportunity to talk to regulators and to the bigger corporates and this sort of thing, which until now maybe we wouldn't have had a hearing. And so I think it's really exciting where there isn't an industry body, there isn't really a voice, because everyone's just working for themselves basically. We don't have an industry body in New Zealand. I wonder whether that might change soon. Who could go and approach the government and say, well, look, this is a real opportunity for innovation. So yeah, I mean that's why I ask you sort of what the
Talk,
forums
talk to me a
are.
little bit more about what you think the opportunity is, and like what is your actual specific ask of government? Are you looking for funding? Are you looking for, what is it that you would want? What's the outcome you'd be seeking?
It's interesting. I mean, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer this, but
Mm,
I don't think there is a specific ask. It really is an open market. We're basically customers of Bitcoin. We are customers that buy electricity and engage in contracts with generators, and so there isn't really any barriers. It's more, I think, a recognition of what this means as a strategic pillar to be building on. And I mean, there's other things that can be talked about that whether it's AI or whatever, but there's actually a real present opportunity that if New Zealand became a mining hotspot, then that's actually got a lot of value for the country, because you're now producing one of the most valuable currencies in the world, and you're exporting that, and it's a digital export. And so you can sell it and you can get US dollars. You can get, because at the moment New Zealanders collectively are importing Bitcoin. They're buying it on the market and bringing it in. But if you're mining it, you're exporting it, and it's a weightless thing. And so it's actually a very interesting dynamic, which, with all the study I've done, I see this just continuing. And you sort of wonder, well, where does the trajectory go? Where every power station in New Zealand has a Bitcoin mine associated with it that turns on and off and is able to help regulate load and all of these things we've talked about today. But at the same time, it's producing this pristine digital asset that can be sent, weightlessly across the world. I mean, that's quite a paradigm shift.
yeah, I mean, I guess a question like, what is the framework that I always sort of say to people when you're seeking to engage, particularly with government, is how does it link into what their government's trying to achieve? Like, so what are their aspirations and objectives? And so basically, it sounds like you're coming in and saying, hey, this is really interesting technology, just wanted to make you aware of it. It's a nice conversation to have. but if you think about what are the challenges, particularly for government, they're revenue constrained at the moment. So, they'll be looking at saying, well, this is great. I want to build industries here. I want to get IP here. How does this grow an industry for New Zealand that, leads to jobs, that leads to productivity, that leads to growth? If this thing is able to just be exported and weightlessly across borders, then, how does it, do I get any tax revenue out of it? Does it actually help me, to solve some of the problems that I'm looking to solve? So I guess that'd be my first point for you to reflect on, is to go, how would you answer those questions? Because you don't just want to turn up into a conversation to just say, hi, we're here, we're doing some stuff, and they go, well, looks like the market's delivering it. So generally you would speak, they would say, well, is there barriers that we can help to reduce here? Are you looking for funding? Which the answer will be no, because we haven't got any money. I think having that clarity around kind of what is your actual ask here and what is it that you want. Because if it is as good as you say it is, then it will just naturally happen, and there won't really be much of a role for government. And if I was sitting on the other side, I'd be saying, I'm not really sure what you want of me.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting perspective, and certainly I appreciate that. You've been in on these kinds of conversations. I guess what I'm seeing, and maybe we can move on to my final point after this, but from my perspective, all of the people I've spoken to, I think this is something that New Zealand broadly is sleeping on, and there is some really awesome people doing some awesome stuff in the private sector. But as a country that is struggling, the New Zealand dollar is not doing too well. The New Zealand economy broadly, despite what many are saying, I mean, it's certainly one of the reasons I left. It's kind of tanking. And I think that is inherently connected with the nature of the New Zealand dollar and the role of government. We've had massive inflation, which has just been really challenging because, they've been printing money, they've been doing all of these things. And now there's an opportunity to get on board with the next thing. And I guess the situation that this reminds me of, Nick, is something like the internet. And if you look at the rollout of the internet, the copper lines were already there, but actually embracing it and saying that this is a pillar, this is a strategic pillar, this is where the world's moving and we need to be on this. The first movers and the early movers were the ones who got the advantage there. And I think New Zealand did really well with the unbundling of the cables and all of that stuff. But ultimately, I think this sits in that same space. So it's more, I guess, visionary. We're not asking anything. In fact, we don't need the government really to do anything here. We don't want them to do anything, actually. But it's sort of like, well, there's a vision here. And given that the energy grid, it's so connected with government policy, like it or hate it, it's like, well, look, there is this magical thing that can make money
Mm.
just by plugging it in. And then the bigger question of what that money actually means, and well, look, why don't you hold a little bit of it? Why don't we, why
Mm.
don't we explore what this could mean for self sovereignty for not only energy but also for money? And so there's kind of some bigger questions, and it gets a little bit maybe beyond the Overton window.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm.
But
And I think that is potentially the challenge, right? Because philosophically, your governments generally find it challenging to hold, and make investments in physical assets into things where they see it as being a market-led outcome, right? So, the I think if I'm playing back what I'm hearing from you, sort of saying like this is going to be something that's going to be very big. You need to actually be investing into this industry as the government itself, rather than reducing any barriers towards other people investing in it. Is that right?
well, I mean,
Mm.
as one potential vector, I mean, certainly, Bitcoin doesn't care what the New Zealand government does. Bitcoin keeps on going, but the countries that don't adopt it, are they going to get left behind? And I think I look at the US, who are really leading this, and you look at, again, you just look at the exchange rate. The New Zealand dollar is tanking relative to not only the US dollar but also to Bitcoin,
Mm. Mm.
and the role of New Zealand in the global economy is challenging when we're starting to kneecap ourselves around some of the regulation on farming and these sorts of things as well. So it's sort of like, well, maybe there's an opportunity to stop, stop doing that stuff and just export Bitcoin that's sustainably mined. We've got all this renewable,
Yeah, I mean,
sustainable energy.
well, I see it as analogous to some of the arguments that were being put forward before it became patently obvious that it was going to be quite challenging. But around exporting hydrogen, for example, using renewable electricity to, I mean, and we export our renewable electricity in terms of our of our aluminium. Really,
Yeah,
I mean that is
and that's got a
effectively,
brand. There's green aluminium,
it's
right?
worth something in a market, but
Yeah, yeah,
there's always ongoing debate about how much that is.
yeah.
So there's certainly think those attributes of it, and I don't know whether that actually plays out in any way within the Bitcoin community in terms of whether you're using renewable electricity or not. Do people really care?
Yeah.
I guess they
Oh,
just care about it being the least cost.
yeah, I mean, I think though
Mm.
generally you'll find that if you can work with those PPAs and those contracts, you can get the best price. You're not having to rely on a commodity fuel like you would with thermal energy. So there's sort of a nuance there that's still early days, but. I do just, I'm conscious of time, Nick. Just my final thing I just wanted
Mm.
to talk about. You mentioned OpenStar and some of the
Mm.
innovation. Is that something you
Yeah.
can share?
Yeah, no, happy to. I could talk. I could talk for a long time about OpenStar. So
Yeah.
yeah, I've been hugely lucky to work with Ratu Al and the team at OpenStar. So OpenStar is a startup, deep tech startup, looking to create fusion power based in Wellington, and turns out that New Zealand actually has some pretty amazing world-leading expertise in superconductivity, and particularly high temperature superconductors, these magnets that have been pioneered through the Robinson Research Institute down in Wellington. So that actual technology allowed Ratu in his time, Ratu Matara, the founder, to draw the links to a particular type of fusion technology called a levitating dipole, which basically imitates the natural effects that we see for the magnetosphere and the Earth. That if you've ever seen the Northern Lights, that's just containing a plasma. And what you're trying to do with a fusion reactor is obviously it's the process that happens in the sun. You're trying to contain a very superheated plasma within a magnetic field and get that hot enough to be able to create fusion, hot enough and enough pressure to create fusion. And so this technology, this novel technology that they've come off based off these high temperature superconductors, has really put them at the forefront of this particular approach. And as of a few weeks ago, they've hit their first test of producing a stable plasma in the reactor. So now they are looking at getting funding. They've already had quite a substantial amount of funding, tens of millions of dollars from New Zealand VC investors, and now they're into the funding rounds. From February next year, they'll be into the funding rounds overseas. So, super exciting time, massive milestone for that team. And my role has really been to, as we've just talked, be that interface, given my experience in New Zealand, the energy sector, between themselves and the government, to go, we want to recognise this as an opportunity for New Zealand. We want to see this grow. It's analogous to kind of the opportunities we've seen in the aerospace, where you're not going to be able to develop and grow the technology, the actual production of the technology here, because you don't have the supply chains, but we can keep the IP here, we can keep the smart people, and we can build the ecosystem, we can build a fusion industry, and also superconductivity more broadly has a huge range of applications for what we've just been talking about, more efficient energy grids, more efficient motors, just a range of other technologies, as well as fusion reactors allow you to do things like medical isotopes and use neutrons in new and novel ways. So the innovation ecosystem that this technology unlocks, superconductivity and fusion for New Zealand, is a real game changer. So yeah, I've been super excited to be involved in that. It's been great, and really consistent with that mission I sort of talked about, where at this stage of my career, where I'm interested to be that help guide these companies with a sustainability vision.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that's awesome stuff. And I mean, there's kind of a bit of a theme here. We've got, again, a very innovative country. We've got, fusion coming out of fusion technology coming out of little old Wellington.
It's crazy.
Aerospace technology. And then again, the Bitcoin story. And I think I am keen, and I do appreciate this is maybe a new area for you, Nick, but I am keen to maybe continue the conversation offline, and maybe we can, talk with a few other people, maybe even some of the guys who are mining down south in New Zealand, and just kind of talk about the way that this could all connect, because I certainly think there is a high value export, an innovation export here with the Bitcoin stuff, and given New Zealand's geographic situation, political stability, etc., it just seems like it's the Goldilocks for some of this stuff to take off, and it can also be just a very valuable thing to do. So I'm keen to continue the conversation, if that's okay.
I'd love to. I mean, it's a fascinating area, and I have a very low level of knowledge. But I guess if anything in my career, I've always seen people say, these technologies will never take off, they'll never scale, they'll never be big enough. I mean, when I first started in the UK, wind was the exact example. No one ever thought wind would be more than 10% of the grid. It would never be cheap enough. And now it's the preeminent renewable technology. Even when I started in New Zealand 13 years ago, there was hardly any wind. So, I think people just need to be brought along on the journey. And, I think I would be saying to you, building your evidence base, really being clear around what it is you think the opportunity looks like and how it links into the other objectives that New Zealand's trying to achieve. Those are really important parts of that conversation that I think you could work on, and be really keen to continue that conversation. I think it's a great conversation to have. Yeah,
sweet. Yeah, gradually then suddenly it all happens. All right, Nick, I appreciate your time and for sharing everything you know, and look forward to catching up again in the future.
Oh no, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you for listening. I am Cody Allingham, and that was The Transformation of Value. If you would like to support this show, please consider making a donation either through my website or by directly tipping to the show's Bitcoin wallet, or just pass this episode on to a friend who you think may enjoy it. And you can always email me at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com.